Shalom, shalom, friends. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Excited to learn with you. Fascinating topic. Why was David chosen as the father of the Messiah? To engage in a text study with really a master of text study, a master teacher, colleague and friend, Rabbi Marc Gitler. There's much to say about him, but I'll keep it brief so we can jump into the sources. He is the visiting Rabbi of Aish SanDiego. So if you ever find yourself in San Diego, you got a place to go. A recipient of the Wexner Fellowship. He was ordained at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. That's where he became a rabbi about 20 years ago. And the founder of Fast for Feast. He lives in Denver, Colorado, with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children. I've been to their home and met their wonderful family. And Fast for Feast, just to let you know about that, that if you're ever going to be fasting one day, or if there's a fast day and you're not fast, that's a place to make a donation for the amount of that you might have spent on food that day, or that you will spend, to make sure other people suffering from hunger can eat. So, friends, we have a delight today to be with Rabbi Gitler. Why was David chosen as the father of the Messiah? Rabbi Gitler, welcome.
Thank you, Rav Shmuley. Thank you so much for the introduction and the words. Let me just, it's a pleasure to be here with you in the Zoom room, as well as I appreciate the flexibility of the Valley Beit Midrash. Initially, I was supposed to teach something about Daniel, a book that people know little about, and instead the topic was switched to this topic about King David. And the reason I did so is that, unfortunately, sadly, tragically, my nephew, David Schwartz, was killed in Gaza about 2.5 months ago. And thus, I wanted to dedicate the learning to him. He was married to my niece, Maytal Gitler, for just under 3 years, and tragically was killed along with his a dear friend of his and Chavrusa named Yakir Hexter. And so that's why the topic is about King David, in memory of him, and we remember him. And let's get started. So the topic I want to explore is David, the father of the Messiah, David the Mashiach. It's sort of taken for granted, if you would ask somebody, what makes somebody eligible to be the Messiah in Jewish life? So it's not clear. Male, female, rich, poor, warrior, peacemaker, none. We're not told. Tall, short, it doesn't matter. Young, old. The one thing that all messiahs, false messiahs, have purported throughout the centuries, from Jesus, Shabtai Zevi, Jacob Frank, and Lahavdil ben HaKodesh u ben HaChol at the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they've all said that their followers have said that they're descendants of David. That's what they are. That's the one piece of information. If you want to be a Messiah, you have to be a descendant of David. So I want to ask that question, why? Why is there that assumption? What is special about King David that makes him the father of the Messiah in our tradition? And one little comment, I gave a talk like this differently, but about a month ago in Seattle, and I mentioned all of those false messiahs together, and a Chabadnik came up to me and he said, I'm really offended. You know, how could you say Lubavitcher Rebbe and Jesus and Shabtai Zevi in the same breath? And that's why I try to say Lahavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, you know, to separate, because obviously Lubavitcher Rebbe was a great and a special man, as opposed to maybe Shabtai Zevi and Jacob Frank. So kudos to him for coming up and saying that to me. If anybody has comments afterwards, whether they be praiseworthy or whether they be about something I said wrong, I'm more than happy to take them. So let's look on the top of the page. I just have this first source just to show you the importance of King David. And this comes from the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah lives way after King David. He's alive when the first temple is destroyed in 586. For years before that first destruction, he's telling the Jewish people that they need to repent. They don't do that. Then he tells them that they have to submit to the Babylonians. They don't do that. The temple is destroyed. But prior to the temple's destruction, together with all of his discussions about how the temple is going to be destroyed, he also has places and words and times where he talks about what is going to happen in the future and a redemptive period. And so in the 23rd chapter of the book of Jeremiah, I'll just read a little bit in Hebrew on top. Hine yamim ba'im num Adonai v'hakimoti leDavid semach tzadik u'malach melech v'askil v'asam mishpat u'tzedakah ba'aretz. Bi'amav tivasha Yudav Yisrael yishkol navetach v'zeh shmo asher yikro Adonai Tzidkenu. And he goes on with more stuff after that. But what those verses are saying is that in the future, right, there's going to be a root, a branch that grows from David. The assumption is that it is coming from King David. That who this figure is supposed to be, whether this figure is the person who leads the Jewish people politically at the time of the building of the second Beit HaMikdash. You know him from the Ma'oz Sur song, Zerubbabel. He's the political leader in the years 520 to 515 when the Jews rebuild the temple, when they're given permission first by Cyrus and then Darius during that time. He's a direct descendant of King David. He's the grandson of Yechoniah, king who was exiled in the year 597. About 80 years later, and he's leading them. It makes sense. And even further into our tradition, if you go during the Talmudic period, the political / religious leaders, what they're called the Nisiim in the Talmud, they were direct descendants of King David. There's a debate whether it was from matrilineal, it was patrilineal, but to show that you were a leader of the Jewish people, you were a descendant of King David. And so the belief is, the understanding is based on these verses and based on our history, that King David is the father of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. But of course, the question is why? Why is that assumption? What is special? What's unique about King David? So to answer the question, there's a very simple, straightforward answer. And the second source on your page, taken from the book of Samuel, the 16th chapter, is when we are first introduced to King David. This is after God gets upset at the first king of Israel, King Saul, because of his sins, and God, to an extent, removes Saul. Saul is sitting on the throne. The people are for him, are his subjects. But as far as God's concerned, Saul is no longer his king. And he sends the prophet Samuel to go and find a king. And in a very beautiful description, if you don't know the chapter, Prophet Samuel shows up at the house of Yishai of Jesse, and he says, one of your sons is going to become king. And the first son is brought out, his oldest son, and God says, no, he's not the king. Shmuel was excited. He was tall. He was good looking. And then the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh. And then finally, then Samuel turns to Jesse. He says, do you have any other kids? What's going on here? And that's where this Samuel chapter 16, verse 11 begins. Vayomer Shmuel Yishai. Tamu hana'arim. Shmuel says to Jesse, you brought out 7 sons. Do you have any more kids? Vayomer od sha'ar hakaton v'hinei ro'eh batson. So he says, there's a little guy. There's a remnant. I didn't even think of him. He's so small. He's so little. He's so nothing. And he's out. He's a shepherd. So Shmuel says to him, go and get him, because I'm not going to leave until you get him. In verse 12, Pasuk Yudbet, Vayishlach vayavyehu admoni yifei anayim v'tov ro'i vayomer Adonai kum mashchehu ki zehu. So they sent for him. He comes. He's described as being an admoni, ruddy, whether it means red hair, whether it means, reddish complexion, Archie Andrews or whatever. And it says that he was good looking. He had nice eyes. And God says to Shmuel, go and anoint him, because he is the one. Vayikach Shmuel keren hashemen v'mashach oto b'kerev achav v'tislachu Hashem el David me'ayom hahu mala vayakam Shmuel vayelech haramata. And so what does Shmuel do? He goes, he takes the flask of oil, he pours it over King David, and King David becomes king with that pouring of that flask of oil. What happens is that David gets a certain sense of enchantment, if you want to put it as such. He has the Spirit of God upon him, and Shmuel goes back home. And so at the most basic level, you could say, well, why is David the Mashiach? Well, it just said so, because God said, Mashchehu. God said, pour the oil over him. And what did Shmuel do? He goes, Vayimashach. He pours the oil over. It's the same word. Mashiach. It comes from the same word. The Mashiach is a person who is anointed. He is a person who, in a sense, he's not necessarily that they're going to pour a flask of oil over his head, but the idea of being appointed is the idea of a Mashiach. And so the most basic level, King David is the Mashiach, because, that's who, that's what we're told, that's what he is. And as I said before, that is who David is continually in history. If you look at the next source on the next page from later in Samuel, this is in the aftermath. David wants to build a temple. Natan says to him, that sounds great. Then he comes back the next day. He says, God doesn't want you to build a temple, but your kingdom will be established forever. So David is Mashiach. David is anointed. David has to be the Mashiach, you could say, because he is the one who's anointed. Now, you could argue with me. You could say that Aaron, the priest, was anointed in his sons, and that is correct as well. And they have the priesthood with them. They don't have the kingship with them. The dynasty of kings is King David. It is forever, and thus it seems to include the Messiah. Still doesn't give us an answer. So David was Mashiach, great. But why was he anointed? Why did God decide upon David? What is special? To understand the question, why David's the father of the Messiah, we have to understand why God chose David. Here we're told he's ruddy. Here we're told he has nice eyes. Is that why God chooses him? Doesn't seem like that's the reason that God will chooses him. And what I want to explore today is what is it about King David? Okay, so we're going to continue. If you skip the next source, that's about Zerubbabel, which I mentioned earlier, even at the time of the early Second Temple period, is the descendants of David, who are the leaders of the Jewish people. And to understand more about David, we're going to go into an understanding of his life and who he is. Okay, so this is right. That's the question. Are there any comments or questions or thoughts that people have? A suggestion? If you think anything that's special about David. If not, that's fine. But just thought I would open up it if anybody wanted to make a comment. If not, okay. So I will go ahead. So we're looking now back in the 16th chapter of the book of Samuel. The first half of the 16th chapter of the book of Samuel is the beautiful description that I shared with you earlier when Samuel the prophet comes to the house of Jesse, and finally, after all, the kid in the corner, all the way out in the field, who's an afterthought, is the one who's anointed as king. The second half of that chapter talks about King Saul. God has left King Saul, and King Saul is terribly depressed. And he has these black periods. And he needs a musician to come and to soothe him. And he asks, go and find me a musician. And that's where we have it. If you look at that source, it's the Shmuel Aleph Parak Tet Zayin, Pasuk Yud Zayin, Vayomer Shaul el Avadav. Ra'una li ish meitav linagain, vaviotim elai. Saul realizes that he has a problem and he wants music therapy. Go and find a musician for me, somebody who can come and can play music for me. Vayan echad mehana'arim. So one of the people, the people who were there in the palace with Saul says to him, Vayomer, Hinei ra'iti ben liishai beit halachmi. He said, I saw a son, a son of Jesse of Bethlehem. And listen to how he's described. Yodea nagain. He knows how to play the instrument. Perfect. That's what Saul wants. Saul wants somebody to soothe his pain. Wants somebody who's going to play him music and he's going to feel better. It's going to take him out of these terrible, bad moods. And there's the idea like this in Jewish life. There's an idea back when Yaakov Avinu, that Yaakov doesn't believe when the brothers come back and say that Joseph is alive and that he's the viceroy in Egypt. And according to the Midrash, one of Yaakov's granddaughters starts playing music for him. And it restores his faith, it restores his hope, it restores his prophecy, and he does believe him. So that's in the Midrash, way after the source was. But this idea of musical therapy, it didn't start 20 years ago. We see it all the way back in the Midrash, all the way back in the books of the prophets. And that's what we would think would be said. He's a great musician. But then the verse doesn't end there. The description continues, right? So he says, Yodea nagain, he knows how to play music. The Gibor Chai, and he's mighty warrior, Vish Milchama, man of war with Avon Davar, and he's a very intelligent person. He can figure things out. Vish Toar Vadonaimo, and he's good looking, and God is with him. Now that's very strange, right? If I asked you, who's your favorite musician, and you would name somebody, whoever it might be, and I asked you why, you would say, I love the way he plays guitar. I love his, whatever it was that you would say, whatever type of music you like, that's what you would say. You wouldn't say, oh, I know that guy, he's a great musician, because he's a great musician. And he's very strong, and he's very intelligent, and he's good looking. That's not what Saul asked for. Saul didn't ask for that. But I believe that what's going on here is that when David is being introduced to the palace, he's being introduced to us as the readers with an understanding of who he is, right? He's not just simply a musician, but he's much, much more than that, which we know, of course, after the fact. And I'll tell you, that's what's special about him, and we'll see why. About a couple of years ago, I was sitting in my mom's house and I picked up a book. Don't remember the name of the book. Don't remember who the author was. But what I remember, what surprised about it most to me was when I was reading the introduction, and it was a book of poetry. I'm not, the greatest analyzer of poetry, far from it. And it was written by a person who was a Marine who did, I think, 3 or 4 tours in Iraq, Afghanistan. And I sat there, I scratched my head, and I said, this is very unusual. You don't usually put poetry together with an Army Ranger or a Marine. I don't remember exactly what he was. And then the light bulb went up in my head. Maybe the lights turned on in the room. And I said, oh my God, that is what is special about King David. What's special about King David is that he combines together 2 things that usually don't come together. This is not left brain, right brain. This is a person who is a person of art, if you want to put it as such, of beauty, who knows how to describe things beautifully. The Psalms, no matter how much you think of, the Psalms were written by David or written by somebody else. Beautiful poetry that's described him. We see that he's a musician. It's described as such. He's a great artist. But on the other hand, he's also a great warrior. He's also a person who can go and defend, and not just defend, but lead his people, lead the Jewish people into battle. And that's what's special about King David, is this uniqueness. Now, he's far from being the only one, but on the first level, just stay with me, that's what's special about it. It's not something that usually comes together, right? When we think about the Torah and we think about the laws and the war in Torah, it's not, most of the laws are, try to keep the warriors in check. Will allow them to do things on the battlefield that maybe they're not allowed to do in other places, which is complex and difficult and beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. One of some of the most difficult commandments in the Torah. We don't usually put these things, beauty and art, together with the idea of being a warrior. That's what's special about David. But what's really unique and special about that, and what's most important about it, is the idea of David being both a musician and a warrior links him with other people in the Bible, other people in the Tanakh. And there are a number of different people who have similarities to David, but there's one that stands out more than anybody else. And the character that has similarities to King David more than anybody else is none other than Esav, none other than Esau. If you look on the next source in the page, I have a little, give away a little there, but I have some boxes there that show just some of the similarities between David and Esav. We know, we just said above, when David is brought in, he was Admoni, he was ruddy. When Esav is born, it says, Vayetze Harishon Admoni. The first one he came out, he was ruddy. And who is that? Like Roshmo, Esav. So they have this similarity in the way that they look. We know that when we meet David, he's out in the field. And Esav, of course, was a man of the field. He was in Ish Sadeh. There are other places where David is out in the field. He has that similarity. A second similarity in this box is their entourage, if we can put it as such. Both of them run around with 400 men. When Yaakov is going back from the house of Lavan, and he's going back to Israel, our patriarch Jacob, and his brother's ready to encounter, he's terrified. Why is he terrified? Because the text tells us, V'hin Esav ba v'imo arba meot ish. Esav is coming, there are 400 men with him. Well, King David, and this is only one of the places, 3 places in the descriptions of his life, we're told that David has 400 men with him. That these men, they gather together, they gather with him. And so it's the sense of being sort of a general, a warrior, that you have these 400 men who follow you. And we don't see it with other people. We only see it with David and with Esav. So David has these links, and it's impossible if you read the Tanakh and you understand what it's trying to tell us. It is clear that it's trying to tell us that David has similarities with Esav. There are some things that they're not similar. It doesn't say that David was a hunter. It doesn't say that, Esav had nice eyes in the same way it describes David being that way. But he's similar to Esav, and it's clear from the text that there's an understanding of who he is. But that's not the only character who David is similar to. And this is really the important part. And you see it in the box here, you may already know. David is not just a character similar who has qualities and follows Esav. He's also a person who has qualities that are linked with Yaakov, that are linked with Jacob. And look at what I have there on the page if you have the sources in front of you, right? So with David, we read this verse earlier, Samuel says to Yishai, he says, are there any other children? And he says, Od Sha'ar HaKaton, the small one, the younger one is still there. When Yaakov and Esav, when Isaac, you know the story, Isaac calls Esav and he says, go to the field and get me some venison so I can get you, so I can have, the Spirit of God come to me. I guess it doesn't only come through music. I guess it also comes through meat. I don't know if Rav Shmuley's still on now, so I can say that without him present. At least one person laughed. So he says to him, go and so I can bless you. And you know the story. And Esav goes out. And in the description, at the beginning of that verse, if you look at the third box under Esav, it says, when Isaac's eyes had atrophy and he had trouble seeing, he called in Esav his older son. So Yaakov's not like him because Yaakov is Sha'ar HaKatan. If you look on under the Jacob in the box, it says Valtabashet Yaakov beno HaKatan. This is talking about Rivka, who goes and she puts the clothing onto her younger son. David in this sense is like Jacob, not like Esav. And in another sense as well, at this moment, at this juncture, he's like Esav in that what? Isaac only calls Esav. Isaac doesn't call Jacob. Yitzchak doesn't say to Yaakov, he doesn't make it a competition. Both of you guys just go out and get the venison. He's an afterthought. We're not even thinking that he would be the one who gets the blessing. Similar to David, that when Shmuel shows up at his house, nobody calls David. Both of them, in a sense, are afterthoughts. And there are other similarities as well. I'll just, mention, I have another one there, but both of them, Yaakov and David, have problems with their father-in-law. Yaakov has problems with Aram, with Lavan Ha'arami. He has to run away from him. And David has problems with his father-in-law, Shaul. And he has to run away from them. And that's the similarity that we have over there, that they both run away. But more so, it's not just that they have problems and that they need to run away. They also have this strange thing that happens where they both have wives switched on them. David is supposed to marry Meirav, Shaul's oldest daughter. Shaul tells David, wanted to kill him. He says, go and bring me the foreskins of 100 Plishtim. And David comes back with 200 foreskins. It's a little, grotesque and whatnot. It probably has to do with the difference between circumcision between the Plishtim, the ancient Philistines, and the Jews. That's probably why it says that. But it means you've killed 200. And David comes back with 200. And when he comes back, Saul says, oh, I'm sorry, I married my daughter Meirav to somebody else. But you can marry my younger daughter Michal, which is opposite but similar to Lavan, who when Jacob thinks he's marrying Rachel, all of a sudden he wakes up the next morning, and of course it's not Rachel, it's Leah. So they have these similarities between the two of them. In some ways, David is Yaakov, and in some ways he is Esav. He has the qualities of both. He goes through the experience of both of these characters together. They go through many similar notions. In fact, I would say that it's sort of summarized in a verse back in that same chapter when Jacob is standing in front of his father, pretending to be his brother Esav, and Isaac, Yitzchak, who is blind, is confused. And he doesn't know who's there. And it says, Vayigash Yaakov el Yitzchak aviv vayimashehu. Jacob comes to his father Isaac. He comes close, and Isaac touches him. And Isaac, Yitzchak says, Vayomer hakol kol Yaakov V'hayadayim yedei Esav. He says, I don't understand the manner in which this person's speaking, his voice, his manners. We don't know exactly why it is. The voice is the voice of Jacob. Maybe he was more refined. He spoke in a certain way. But the hands, Rebecca had gone and taken the furs, sort of the camouflage that Esau would wear when they would hunt, and gave them to Yaakov to wear. That is, the hands are the hands of Esau. And Yitzchak is confused. But to me, that is the key. When we think about King David, the poet warrior, the artistic king, what is he? David is both Yaakov and Esau. He embodies the two of them. He, in a sense, he's like one and he's like the other. He has the qualities of both of them. And at the same time, he has the deficiencies of both of them. He has their strengths, and as well, he has their weaknesses. But if we think like mythically about the idea of twins in the ancient world, and what does it mean to be twins? Twins are together, and then they become separated, but they're supposed to be a whole. They're supposed to be together. And we know, of course, that that's not what happens with Yaakov and Esau. Yaakov and Esau have a relationship generally of hatred for each other. Yaakov is conniving. He tricks Esau. He takes advantage of him. Esau is ready to kill Yaakov. And Yaakov has to run away. And there is that meeting between the two of them, but they go their separate ways. And to me, this is actually a tragic moment in the Torah. Yaakov comes back. He's terrified. We'll talk about that in 1 second, because that's the most important thing to an extent. Yaakov is terrified of his brother. And he meets his brother. This is the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach. Meets his brother, and he's terrified. And he bows down to him, and he's doing all these things. And Esau says, "Oh, get up. Who are you?" And Esau kisses him. And Esau asks him, "Who are all these people?" And he says, "This is my family. God has been very good to me," and blah, blah, blah. And Esau says to Yaakov, "Come with me back to where I live, Har Seir." And Yaakov says to him, "You know, you and your warriors, you go very fast on your horses, or you're very fast on your chariots, or whatever it was that Esau had." He said, "I'm here with my family. We got a lot of young kids. So you go ahead and we'll catch up with you." And Yaakov never goes. Yaakov never goes. He never joins Esau. They remain separate. Now, you could argue that good fences make good neighbors, and sometimes we know that that's the case. But to me, that's a missed opportunity. That's a terrible mistake to an extent that Yaakov makes. Because imagine if Yaakov partnered with Esau. Imagine if they had the qualities of the both of them together. And to me, who has those qualities of the both of them together? Who embodies those qualities? It is, of course, David. It is David HaMelech. David HaMelech is the one who embodies these qualities. And because he embodies these qualities, he represents the idea of taking two disparate parts that are supposed to be together. Left brain, right brain, however you want to understand it, the warrior and the poet. The king and the musician, the artist, the two of them that are separate. David is the person who brings them together. And that is what's special. That is what's unique about King David. You have a lot of verses and the sources, the next thing on your page. I'm not going to read through all of them, but let me tell you outside what that is. This idea of David being both Yaakov and Esau, embodying, in a sense, both of them, personifying both of them, comes to a head in the 25th chapter of the book of Samuel. The 25th chapter of the book of Samuel, David is already on the run. His father-in-law wants to kill him. And he's out in the fields. And it sort of sounds kind of mafioso style. I don't know exactly that's what it is. But he's offering protection. He and his 400 men, or sometimes even 600 men, are offering protection to the shepherds and to the sheep and the animals of a man named Naval. And they have the big shearing day. They shear all the sheep, and David wants to get stuff from Naval, because he's provided this military protection to his men, and to his sheep, etc., etc. And this guy Naval, and the word Naval means like schmuck, I don't know the best description, it means somebody who's very base, somebody who's very coarse, somebody who's very ill-mannered. And so that's his name, and that's the way he acts. He says, who is David? Who is this? He's a dog who runs away from his master, and I'm not giving him anything. And David gets so upset. And he tells his men in the 25th chapter, he says, go and get your weapons, and we are going to his house, and it's going to be a just destruction. It's going to be complete murder. In fact, later on in the chapter, David says, I was on my way to kill anyone who urinated on the wall. That's the way he says, that's the way he describes men in sort of this base way, right? Anybody who pees on the wall, which I assume means men. It's later on, it's the words of the Tanakh, not my words, that he says. And he's on his way, and he's bloodthirsty, and he's got his knives and his swords and whatever else. And today we know what else he would have with him. And this woman, the wife of Nabal, Abigail, she hears about it, and she's terrified. And she sends out messengers. She sends out men without telling her husband to go and to talk to David. And she sends food to go out to presents to go give him. My husband didn't give you anything, but you deserve this. This is what you deserve. And then she comes and finally she meets him and she bows down to him and she presents these items to him and, sort of says to him, I'm sorry. My husband is a terrible, base, coarse, horrific person. And I'm sorry he treated you this way. And it wasn't right. It wasn't the correct thing to do, what he did to you. And David looks at her and he says to her, okay, you have pacified me. You have calmed me down from the ledge. And in the end, if you want to look at the end of all of these, verses, he says to her, he says to her that this would have been a terrible spilling of innocent blood, that I would have killed all of the men, and it's only because you showed up here with this food and to calm me down, and that this did not happen. And in a sense, the way that this story is written, this 25th chapter of the book of Samuel, it is supposed to be a similar story to the aforementioned story of when Yaakov and Esav meet up after 20 plus years. The difference in the story, or you could say the story, is that Abigail, the wife of David, she in a sense is Yaakov. Yaakov sends out messengers before him when he's scared. Yaakov sends out presents when he's scared. Yaakov bows down multiple times to Esav because he's scared. Yaakov addresses Esav as Adoni, my master, multiple times. He calls himself Eved, he's just a lowly servant. And that is exactly the same things that Abigail does in this chapter. And in a sense, or really what's going on here, is that this is a moment in David's life. David is Esav, and David is Yaakov. He's both Yaakov and Esav. Who is he going to be? And if Abigail hadn't intercepted him, if she hadn't done these things to him, David would have been Esav. He would have spilled all of this innocent blood. He's upset at Nabal. So who is he? He's like Haman, who's upset at one Jew and wants to kill all the Jews. Is that what he's like? David, I'm upset at this guy Nabal because he didn't fulfill his obligations to me and he disrespected me. So I'm going to go kill 100 men, his whole clan, whatever it might be. David would have gone off the ledge completely. And Abigail comes and she pacifies him. And this is very much the critical moment in David's life where he has to, in a sense, describe who is he going to be. Is he going to go off the ledge completely, or is he going to remain this person who can embody both the qualities of Yaakov and the qualities of Esav together? The best of both worlds is what David manages to be. And it's because this heroine in the story, not him, but his wife, Abigail, who is the heroine who saves him at this time. And I would say as follows. David is the person who brings back the brokenness. We have a breakup between Yaakov and Esav. The two of them should be together. And the story of the book of Genesis, the book of Breshit, is a story very much, and there are many themes to it, but one of the major ideas in the story are the mistakes that are made that causes families to break up, and in the long run, in the entirety of the Tanakh, causes the children of Israel, the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to have enemies. And I'll give you the best example that you know of. It's early in Genesis, right? They've just come back from Egypt, where they gained a tremendous amount of wealth, both Yaakov and his nephew Lot, and they have too much cattle. They have too much, and there's not enough place. There's not enough grass. There's not enough feed for their animals. And their shepherds start to get into a fight. And Avram comes to his nephew Lot, and he says to him, "We're brothers. We're family. We shouldn't have a fight. So what should we do? Let's separate. If you go to the right, I'll go left. If you go south, I'll go north. If you go east, I go west. Choose whichever place you want to go." And Lot chooses to go to stone. That's what happens. It's a tragic moment. Think Lot is somebody who is an orphan. His parents are dead. Avraham is somebody, along with his wife Sarah. At that point, Sarai, he's Avram, doesn't have any children. So here you go. You have these people who all they do is want a child, and you have this child, who's not such a child, obviously, who has a father and a mother figure in his aunt and uncle. And what happens? Avraham goes this way, and Lot goes that way. They separate. Yes, Avram will go, and he'll save him when he's a captive, but Avram and Lot separate. And who becomes Lot's descendants, according to the Torah? It is one son named Ammon and one son named Moab. And for hundreds of years, from the time the Jews are on their way to Israel with Moses, they have an enemy named Ammon, and they have an enemy named Moab. Those are enemies of the Jewish people. They're constantly fighting. The first great battle of the life of King Saul is against Nachash HaAmoni. So the book of Genesis, over and over again, I told you Yaakov and Esau. We have the same thing here with Avraham and Lot, is a book where when families make errors, when they break up, the consequences last for generations. They last for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years. That's one of the messages of the book of Bereshit. You can look back at it and see it. And that's the difference when eventually Yosef combines together with his brothers. Even though there are troubles between Yosef and his brothers, they come back together. The split is not forever. And so that is ultimately why David is the king who is the father of the Messiah. Because the world is a broken world. We know that. And we have so much to do to fix the world. And if we want to fix first, right, charity starts at home, or fixing starts at home, and help starts at home. And the first thing, if you don't want to have a broken community, you start with not having a broken family. That's where it begins. And King David embodies this idea of being Yaakov and Esau. King David embodies this idea of taking back the tragedy of when Avram separates with his nephew. When Yaakov and Esau go their different ways, King David is the person who brings it all together. And that is the idea of the Messiah. Exactly what will the Mashiach be? What will be the messianic times? There are these debates amongst Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages, in the Talmud. I don't know. I haven't seen it. There are those who say the Mashiach is going to be, there's going to be miracles. And there are others who say, no, the messianic times is going to be just like today. The only difference is that there's not going to be any anti-Semitism, which sounds fairly messianic and impossible to me. But the idea, either way, whichever way you take it, it's a time of peace. It's a time where people are together. It's a time when there isn't fighting between different groups. And that's who King David is. And he demonstrates it one other way with his life. And I'll conclude with this, and then if you have questions. After the death of Saul, and this is the early chapters, if you want to look back, of Samuel 2, David has already been told by God, by Samuel the prophet, that he's going to be king, but he's not sitting on the throne. He's not doing that. And so David is getting, becomes king of Judah. And Saul has a son named Ishbosheth, who's made king of Israel. And David knows he's going to be king. It's been told to him. It's clear. He's enchanted. Everybody loves him. He's the greatest warrior. Everybody, the women and the men, they come out to the field and they sing his praises. And he knows he's going to be king. And he tries to become king through peace. Over and over again, the way he becomes king is attempting through peace. But his general Yoav and Ishbosheth's general Avner are constantly fighting. And there's one story where their men meet up and they're wrestling, and it's 12 of the men of Avner and 12 of the men of Yoav, and they all die. All 24 somehow simultaneously die. Whether you believe the story or not, what the story is trying to tell us is that they are imploding. And why are they imploding? Because they are fighting to become king. And David recognizes if you want to become king of Israel, it can't be just through fighting, because he has to bring everybody together. His idea is not about separation. It's not about breaking families apart, but is about putting them back together. And so David, to me, is the father of the Mashiach. David is the father of the Mashiach because he represents this aspect. And I think in our own lives, I'm not going to say, community unity and all these things that, people talk about. It's okay to have different thoughts, to have different ideas, and people have all sorts of different ideas, but to try to keep families together, to try to keep friends together is one of the greatest things that can be done. There are times that fences are made between us, but it shouldn't be in the way that we separate completely, like Avram says to Lot. It shouldn't be that Yaakov ignores when his brother says, come join me in Har Seir, and Yaakov says, I'll be there later. Don't wait for me, and then never follows him. And that is who King David is. And hopefully we understand that idea of the Messiah. And hopefully, I don't know if any of us on this call is the Messiah. Hopefully we can put that into the way that we act with others. And right, you think about it just in this country today, right? The right can't talk to the left can't talk to the right. This one's insulting this one, that one's insulting that one. Is the whole country going to implode because of it? I don't know. I hope not. But what we need, in a sense, is a messianic figure for this country. We need somebody who can somehow build those bridges between those different people. And so I would say we need a Davidic figure in this country, like to an attempt to bring this country together. Not a simple thing, just like it's not so simple. We're waiting for it in America, just like the Jews have been waiting for the Messiah to appear all of these years. So I'm going to conclude there. I thank you for listening. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Gitler. Yes, if anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hands and we can call on people to unmute. And you can always type things in the chat as well. Hi, Eva.
Hi, it's Eva. So I thought when I signed up for this, I thought you were going to talk about all the morally reprehensible things that David did in his life and how could he be the father of the Messiah. So would you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And yeah, it's when we're lauding David, it's hard. So David, I would say, it's an excellent question. And it's the question, it's the key question about David's life. Key question about David's life is his sleeping with a married woman and then having her husband killed, is what Eva is talking about, the episode with Bathsheba. And there's nothing that can be said to make that episode any better. The rabbis in the Talmud try to whitewash it. They say anybody who says David sinned is mistaken, and they say that the men who would go out in the battle would give their wives, they would divorce their wives in case they got lost, and so he didn't really sleep with a married woman. And to me, it's the rabbis are saying a terrible thing. If you read the book there, I cannot in any way justify David's actions. It is a terrible moment of his life. And if you would look and analyze and read the entire book of Samuel 2, you would see that David's life is basically charmed, that everything looks perfect at that time until he sleeps with Bathsheba. And when Nathan the prophet comes in and tells him, there was a guy who had 1 million sheep, and there was a guy down the block from him who had 1 sheep. And the guy with the 1 million sheep was the guy who had 1 sheep, and he slaughtered his sheep because somebody came to his house because he wouldn't want to take his own sheep. And David said, the man deserves the death penalty of 4 times he should pay, etc., etc. David immediately says, right? And Nathan says, you, Ata Ha'ish, that's you. David immediately admits to his sin, and then his life becomes a living hell. And that ultimately, I can't in any way, shape, or form explain to you or validate David's behavior. The only thing that I can say is David is a character who pays the price for his mistakes and his errors, who admits to his mistakes and his errors. That's in a sense who he is. It's I'll tell you one thing with that, Eva. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? I don't know. One of the great differences. The stories of King David and Solomon are really in two places in the Hebrew Bible and the Tanakh. They're in the book of Samuel and they're in the book of Divrei Hayamim. And there is one glaring difference during the lifetime of King David. There are a few differences, but there's one glaring one, which is in the book of Divrei Hayamim, which is maybe more of the Chronicles of the Kings. The incident of Bathsheba is not listed. It's not written. It's not spoken about. So, Eva, I am like Chronicles, and you are like Samuel. And in that way, you are better, and you're telling a true and full picture in a way better than I am. And, so I would say ultimately in answering your question, David pays the price. And it's the great question that's asked. David is charmed. David is loved by God. He makes a terrible error. He pays for his sin. He pays for his sins. He attempts to repent. He attempts to do tshuva. Sometimes we know in life there's nothing that you can do. You've done something so bad. But ultimately, to me, it's less the actualities of David's life, and it's more of what he represents in the idea of these two characters coming together, of taking things that are broken and putting them back together in a way that, of course, he could never put Bathsheba and Uriah back together after he had broken them up. So I appreciate the question. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, but maybe just a little bit more to think about. If you want to say something back or anybody else wanted to ask another question, please.
Steve, did I see your hand up?
Yeah,
Hi.
thank you. First, Rabbi, I love the way you present. You have a lot of energy, a great sense of humor, and I really appreciate your being here. My question.
Steve, down the block for me, there's a house for sale. If you want to move, you can follow me around and tell everybody that. That would be. But thank you for the compliment.
I think I'm living in that house right now, so
thank you.
My question comes from someone who is borderline illiterate on Torah and Chumash. Love pluralism. That's why I'm here. The question has to do with the word Messiah. I'm not sure what that means or what is supposed to happen when there's a Messiah. Will Judaism end at that point and something else will arise? Is the Messiah going to be a Messiah, or is it going to be something troublesome, a portal into some things that we're not really prepared for?
That's an excellent question, and I don't think we realistically and really have an answer to that question. The word Mashiach is used in the Tanakh much more about somebody like Moses or somebody like David. David doesn't. He ushers in a slight period of peace and prosperity for the Jewish people, which happens during the reign and the time of his son Shlomo, King Solomon, whose time is a peaceful time. But it's a time of peace. It's not as if the world has changed drastically. And over again, the word Mashiach is used, Messiah is used to describe somebody who's going to lead the Jewish people to a time of peace, but we don't know what that means, right? There are those in a few comments about there are those in Israel who called, I don't know if they still do, Ben Gurion the Mashiach. Not a political question, but after 2,000 years of being stateless, who was the person who led, in a sense, the Jews to have a state of Israel? Was Ben Gurion. So there are people who, from a secular point of view, called Ben Gurion the Mashiach. I would say the billion-dollar question, or perhaps I wouldn't billion, it's like $1 trillion question is, Isaiah is at chapter 54, chapter 52, the suffering servant, the Messiah, which of course the Christians say refers to Jesus, and the Jews say it does not refer to Jesus. So it's completely unclear what the messianic period will be. It's completely unclear what the characteristics are of this person. It's completely unclear of who he has to be. There's statements in the Talmud where people talk about the Messiah dying. And other people say, are you crazy? And some of that came up with, the followers, if you know the followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that some believed, or some still believe, even after he passed away, a great man, that he's the Messiah, and they point to that over there. It's completely unclear. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it will be. But I would say, without taking what becomes of it in Jewish tradition, in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, it means a transformational figure who will usher in a time of peace and prosperity for the Jewish people, which doesn't mean a time of miracles. It's not the unicorns and when pigs fly or whatever it is. The Bible's description of a messianic sort of time, and you may know it from the letter that George Washington wrote. I think there's one in the Touro Synagogue is it Providence, Rhode Island, and I think there might be also one in the synagogue in New Orleans, and it was already famous, but made more famous to the in Hamilton, where he quotes, "Let every man sit under his vine and fig tree." That is the messianic vision of the Tanakh. It's just being able to live in peace and prosperity. And I'm not talking about billionaires and, jumping on private jets. That's not what it's referring to. It's just about living in peace, securely, not worried about being harmed in some way. So the messianic period is, in the Tanakh, what a Mashiach is. It's not this messianic vision of the end of days, and think of medieval paintings of the apocalypse and things of that. That's not at all what it is. It's about a transformational figure who will lead the Jews to a time of peace. Not lead the Jews to a time, and there's some where it's a little bit more, that everybody will recognize that there is one God, and that but we're going beyond the focus of that. If let's say, for example, Isaiah chapter 2, which talks about beating their swords into plowshares in a world being completely in peace, that's a messianic vision. But it's so very unclear, is what I would say to you, Steve, and I appreciate that question that you asked. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Rabbi Gitler, thank you so much for being here and for leading. This was a great presentation. I know we all enjoyed it. Just want to let everyone know about our next class, which will be on April 4th. Women's Empowerment Equals Jewish Empowerment, with Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz, and that will be at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So hope you can all tune into that as well. And thanks again for being here. Have a great day, everyone.